So, this is about the Scale Up project, and the current version of the name is an acronym standing for Student-Centered Active Learning Environment with Upside Down Pedagogies. Actually, the last four letters originally were, let's see, it was Student-Centered Activities for Large Enrollment University Physics. And so it's changed quite a bit since then, partly because most of the adopters, there's 191 dots now on that map. That I know about. Most of the adopters are actually smaller than the classrooms that I originally designed this for. And they're certainly no longer just in physics. And the really difficult one is they're no longer just in universities. And I had to come up with another U word that I could use instead of universities because it's in high schools and middle schools. And so upside down pedagogies seem to work. But I like that because the first part of the name talks about the learning environment, which is sort of what you're sitting in now. And the last part of the name talks about what goes on in that environment. So the central aspects of the whole thing. There's an example, probably one of the most expensive scale-up classrooms anywhere, is at MIT. They have several what they call TEAL classrooms because they have to have their own acronym. Technology Enhanced Active Learning, but it's a scale-up adaptation. Yes?
Why does California get a gold star?
Oh, is there still a gold star on? Oh, there it is. Because I created this map, I haven't updated my map yet, when I was giving a workshop at the Windward School in LA. So they got their gold star. Sorry about that. I could put a gold star up a little farther north. That'd be interesting. I could just enter the name of the city wherever I happen to be and I'll put a gold star up there. Everybody was really impressed. I'll have to work on that one. Anyway, probably one of the things, hopefully, that you're wondering is why in the world is this guy lecturing to us if he's going to be lecturing to us about how we shouldn't be lecturing? And that's because you're special. And we'll talk about that. And you have figured out how to learn from lecturing, and so I can get away with it. And in certain situations, it's actually probably one of the very best mechanisms for getting information across. As long as it's always very good at transmission. Whether the reception's working or not, that's another story. But it turns out you are all very good receivers. So there's no impedance mismatch if you're a physicist. So we'll talk about that in more detail as we go on. But in any case, please be sure to interrupt me. Because without somebody asking me a question that I probably don't know the answer to. So be sure to interrupt me anytime you've got a question. I'm from the physics department at NC State, and now there's a gold star over there in Raleigh. And that's our current batch of graduate students. We graduate about one a year, maybe two a year, depends on the year. The biggest problem we have is that they get jobs before they get done. And so in fact, Jeff is teaching at a full-time position, faculty position, tenure-track position in Indiana. And he's hopefully going to be defending his thesis this semester. But I guess it's a good problem to have, but it is an interesting problem. But we study the teaching and learning of physics. In case you're trying to decide whether this is actually worthwhile or not, eventually I will show you data for most of these things. And I do have data in papers that you're welcome to take a look at for all these at multiple institutions, not just at NC State and not just in physics, although that happens to be where we've got most of the data. So, this is what I hope to do between now and an hour and 15 minutes from now. I want to spend about half the time discussing why we should even be doing these things. Because I'm talking about fairly radical change. I mean, you can see the room looks different, like a restaurant. But more than that, it's sort of a philosophical change in what you think should be going on in a classroom. And it's not easy, and so there better be a good reason to do it. So I'm going to try to set the stage for that. And then the last half of the time we'll talk about specifically what Scale Up does and how we can respond to some of those things that are going on in the first part. So, first part, big question is, what is the problem? It turns out that's really easy to answer. The problem is students aren't learning as much as we want. Okay? There was a nice study that was done, published not long ago, showing that 40% of our 12th graders are at the lowest level of proficiency as measured by this one scale. And in fact, only 21% are proficient. And you might worry about, well, what does it mean to be proficient? Well, if you know the difference between a star and a planet, you are proficient, at least in that little piece of knowledge. So the standards are not very high, and we're not even getting to that. So that's a problem. Students aren't learning as much as we want. This is from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Whoops. Question? No. There's another study that was done by Ehrman and ROCSA in 2011 showed that more than a third of our students aren't really making any progress after 4 years of college in critical thinking, complex reasoning, or writing, which are super important skills if you go and ask employers. Saving you a spot right over here. So students aren't learning as much as we want them to, so that's a big problem. But another part of it that's almost as important is the fact that they're not enjoying it. This is one of my favorite quotes. I give this to my students every semester. Education is one of the few things a person's willing to pay for and not get. I mean, if you think about it, if there was a sign outside the classroom door that said class canceled today, you could sit and watch rejoicing going on in the hallway, right? Whereas if, let's say there was a movie going on in the student center, and they put a sign up that says movie canceled, and there's not quite as much excitement. Well, we probably can't expect education to be as entertaining as media that are specifically designed to entertain, but it would be nice if students could at least appreciate our field so they could say, well, physics is not for me, but I could understand how somebody could really get into that. Or biology is not for me, but I can see how somebody could spend their entire career studying such and such. And we're not making that kind of impact, at least not as much as we would like. So that's a real problem as well. But there are more difficulties. Students aren't as good as they used to be. You may have said this, and you were right, but perhaps not in the way that you think. Back in the dark ages, when I graduated from high school, less than half of my peers went on to college. Okay? Well, now we are over 2/3, about 70%, almost 3/4, and it's still rising as more and more people recognize that the ticket to the middle class is some kind of college education. So more and more people are going to college, and if you think about it, you imagine the demographics, being some kind of a bell-shaped curve. It's not the people at the high end of that curve who are now deciding to go to college, right? They've been coming all along. It's folks at the lower part of the curve, which is good, but that causes two difficulties. The one difficulty is that we are now having to teach a broader range of students. Okay? The other difficulty is that it's shifted the average down. So in fact, students aren't as good on average as they used to be. Now the top students are probably at least as good as ever, but we've got a broader spectrum than before. And so it's changed the game. And of course, we know how to deal with that. What do you do with that 23% or so that didn't used to come to college that are now? Well, it's pretty easy, you just fail them, right? They shouldn't have been here anyway. Well, we can't afford to do that. This is the STEM pipeline. Are you familiar with the term STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and math? I've been drilled into you. Well, the STEM pipeline is leaking. If you look at about 4 million kids who are in 9th grade, not all of them graduate from high school, drip out. Not all of them major in a STEM field, a lot of them drip out. Those that major in a STEM field, not all of them make it. By the time they graduate, nationally, we're putting out less than 170,000 STEM graduates a year. Nationally. That's not very many. That's a problem. We can't afford to fail a whole bunch of people. Now, I'm not suggesting that we lower the standards, because that actually makes the situation worse. Because then employers can't tell from a diploma whether somebody is able to do something or know something or not. Right? So we can't lower the standards, but we have to find a way, or we should try to find a way, to get people who never would have even gone to college before through, and to get the kinds of skills that they need. According to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, we need 1 million more STEM workers in the next 10 years, beyond what we're currently planning to graduate. And just in my own state, we need 229,000 in the next 5 years. Well, if there's only 170,000 a year nationally, not all of them are coming to North Carolina. So we're going to be hurting. We're going to be hurting for STEM graduates who are good. Employers are saying that the people that we are putting out don't have the skills that they should. You might have heard these called 21st century skills. You survey employers over and over and over again. This is just one of them, and this is one of the more recent ones. 89%, is that what that's saying? Yes, 89% of employers say that education should be putting more emphasis on communication than we are now. Critical thinking, teamsmanship, locating and evaluating information. So employers want these skills. Notice that content isn't on that. That's discouraging if you're like me and you teach content. But it's not, it's not the end of the world. If you're trying to teach problem solving, you have to have some kind of problem. So I have them work on physics problems, but I teach them kind of generic ways to solve problems that will work with physics problems. If you're going to be communicating something, they need to have some content to communicate. So we can teach our content and give students chances to practice these skills if we think about what we're doing. One of the reasons that content is not on there, I mean, it is on these lists, but it's always way, way, way down in terms of importance, is that most employers, especially the high-tech employers, recognize that a lot of the content that we teach now is going to be out of date soon. And a lot of the really good content is proprietary. So Hewlett-Packard is not going to tell you how they make their printer cartridges spit out those neat little drops of ink until you're working for Hewlett-Packard. Then they'll hand you a notebook and say, go sit in your cubicle and learn how this works. But they don't want to spend the time to teach you how to communicate or how to be a team player. That takes more than one person. You can't send somebody into a cubicle to learn how to be a team player. Okay? They want the schools to take care of that. They don't have time or money to do that. So we're not providing what they need. But here's the real problem. Kids today are different. These are my grandchildren, and I don't know what they're doing, but they're on a computer, and they're little. They are what Mark Prensky calls digital natives. And he was making the analogy with languages. If you learn a language when you're very young, then you will be a native speaker of that language, and you probably won't have an accent, and you'll be just fine. If you learn that language later, we've been saving you a seat. Somewhere, right over there. If you learn that language later in life, like in college, then you will always speak that language with an accent. You could learn Spanish in college. You could be a Spanish major. You could then move to Mexico. And in 50 years, you'll be the 75-year-old that speaks with a funny American accent. And that's just the way it is, because when you were learning that language, when you were learning your home language, you were very, very young, and that's when the brain really works well to make these connections. And later on, it sort of ossifies a bit. That's what happened to me. 3/4 of the kids that are 4 and under use computers. And the next one is what's really scary. 7.5 hours a day in front of a screen. How do you get 11 hours of content into only 7.5 hours in front of a screen? Yeah, multiple screens, multiple windows. They'll be, diddling on their phone with Twitter while they're watching a video over here while they are also having a word processor open and they're doing something else. They're very good at that. They're not as good at it as they think they are, but they're a whole lot better at it than me, because I didn't learn to do that until I was much, much later. They've been doing it since they were little kids. So they have trained their brains to work differently than mine does. So students are digital natives. The average teenager sends a text every 12 minutes while they're awake. And there's actually a concern among physicians because the kids take their phones to bed. And so at 3 o'clock in the morning, they'll go tweet, and they'll look at it, and they'll tweet back and go back to sleep. In another 15 minutes, it'll come back. So it's disrupting their sleep patterns. But on average, it's every 12 minutes they're sending a text. It changes the way kids think about and think with technology. This is the way my students take notes. Something important, they take a picture of it with their phone. This is the way I think about technology. But think about it. I mean, look at this. This is amazing. Look. She's using mashed plant fibers, and she has to write on it with a special pigment stick. It has to be encased in plastic so you don't get the pigment all over your hands. Otherwise, you make a big mess. Isn't that archaic? Well, to a kid, to a student, why would anybody ever want to do that? First time I saw students taking notes like this, I went over and I looked at their phone with my old man glasses and I said, "Can you see that?" And I said, "No." But then they opened up their notebook and they had printed out the previous pages, and page after page after page. And they had written, and it was great big, of course, so you could see it. And they had written right on top of it their own comments. I mean, it was brilliant. And I never would have thought of that, because I'm of the generation that thinks that telephones are devices for speaking to people over a distance. And that's just a nice extra feature that they have if you wouldn't pay. The brain is plastic, and so that changes the way students think. There's something in cognitive science called Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together wire together. So as kids do these things, use technology in peculiar ways to us, their brain gets better at it, and they start thinking that way. They expect instant feedback. They don't plan on paying attention for more than 30 seconds at a time because something else is going to get their attention. That's just the way it is. There's an interesting study here, in case you're trying to figure out what all this stuff is, that shows that there are physical changes in the brain with learning. This was a neat study. They taught people to juggle. And then they did brain scans before and after, and it's a little hard to see. Well, it is really hard to see, so I'll just point and wait. I'll make it much clearer, of course. They measured the area in those yellowish areas there, and before they taught people how to juggle, and they got a baseline. Then they taught them to juggle, and they found that they had about a 2.5 or 2.75% increase in brain matter. And then the neat part about it is, then they told those people as part of the study, you are not allowed to practice juggling for some length of time. I forget what it was, but anyway, it went back down, not to 0, but it did go down. But there is a physical change in the brain as you learn. That's new. We haven't known that for me. We've known that for probably 20, 25 years. We used to think that you were born with a certain number of brain cells, and you might kill a few off in college, but other than that, you're sort of stuck with that number, and that was it. Well, it turns out that isn't what's important. What matters are the connections between the brain cells, and those change. Your brain is different now than it was when you came in the room. Your brain is rewired, has been rewired. Literally, I mean, it's different. Physically, it is different than it was before. And so brains work a little differently. But the brain is plastic, it's moldable, it's changeable. Okay? And kids have been using technology since they were little, and they have changed their brains. They have grown up with Google. They've gone from information scarcity to abundance. I did a search in Google for the word Google. And I got 12 billion hits. It took less than 1/10 of a second. I mean, I use Google all the time. You probably do too. I still can't believe it. Because you know that if you can't find what you're looking for in that first page or two, it's probably not Google's fault, right? They've got these incredible algorithms that know other things that you've looked for, and they can find what you're looking for, probably. So if you can't find it on the first page or two, you just do a little bit better job with these search terms. Well, kids have grown up with Google. It's about 11 or 12 years old, and so if you think about how old kids are in college, they probably learned to read with Google. Because you have to know how to read and type to be able to find Angry Birds or whatever it is you're looking for. And so it's a great motivator, but they have come to expect that instantaneous feedback. So it's just a different world for them. And what's interesting is it has literally changed the way they think, in fact, everybody. There's a neat study that came out in the journal Science a year ago last summer, and it talked about the fact that the internet has become sort of like a hard drive, an external hard drive for us. And to the point where people are now getting to be better at remembering where to find information than the information itself. And that's what's interesting about it is this one quote I have from the article. Human memory is adapting to new communications technology in an evolutionary sense. I mean, what is evolution? It's how organisms change and respond in response to changes in their environment. Well, when scientists are studying evolution, what do? They use fruit flies or amoebas or something bacteria that cycle really fast and make changes really fast. Well, if you're looking at one organism, what's the one part of our bodies that's designed to change very rapidly? The brain. I mean, your brains are different now than they were, 15 minutes ago. So our brains are evolving and changing the way they function because of the internet. And so you're left with this. But it changes other things. It changes students' attitudes. You can go into almost any lecture hall anywhere in the country, sit down and listen for 2 minutes to find out what the topic is, and then pull out your phone and within 30 seconds bring up stuff that's more current than what's being lectured on. Unless the person doing the lecturing happens to have done research or something in that area and they just haven't gotten around to publishing yet. You can probably bring up something that's more current. Students know that. It's changing the relationship between the teacher, who used to be the source of knowledge, and the students. The students know they can bring up better stuff. What if you're trying to teach them something really crazy, like this evolution stuff? You might be trying to tell them about evolution. Well, they can go to the web and find these beautiful websites that are, I mean, they're absolutely gorgeous and they look really good. And they say that evolution is just a theory. Well, why should they believe you? So it's a problem. It has changed the education game. Students have options now that they didn't used to have. You may have heard of this little fly-by-night outfit called the University of Phoenix. If they ever get big, we have to worry about them. Well, guess what? They're the biggest school in this hemisphere. Every year they bring in about $1 billion in venture capital. Here's the scary part. They are accredited. So if a student doesn't want to sit through your Sterling lectures at 8 o'clock in the morning when they're asleep, they can take courses from Phoenix or some other place that's accredited. And they can watch them at 3 o'clock in the morning when they are awake. Or they can play them back when they fall asleep or something like that. But these schools are accredited, and so students are going to start coming to us and saying, I want to matriculate as a junior because I've got all my intro courses out of the way. And what are we going to do? They're accredited. If we say, well, you don't get the full experience, the full Seattle Pacific experience that you would online, and they'll say, I don't want it. I just want these courses. So then we're going to have to say, well, you get something better at Seattle Pacific than you do online. Well, if all we're doing is standing and lecturing at them, it's pretty easy to find a lot of research that shows that we're in trouble. So what do we do about this? Well, the problem is this is the way students like to learn. Nearly a third of all students are taking an online course right now. Now, it's probably not from Phoenix. It's probably from their own home institution. But this is the way they're used to getting information. So even though a faculty member teaching an online course, even if you've been doing it for 5 years, it still feels a little weird. To students, this is their life. There's nothing unusual for them to take an online course. This is showing on this graph two things. One's the total enrollment. You can see the total enrollment is going up some. We're over 20 million now in college. But look at the percent online, just since 2002, from less than 10% to over 30%. So it's growing very rapidly. So students have options they never used to. And what that means is that this is not the best option for them. It doesn't fit the way their brains work. And that's just an intimidating thing. This is actually a pretty nice lecture hall. I got this off the web from some school that will remain nameless, showing their facilities, because it's a pretty neat lecture hall. But, there's this person right here. That person is happy about this, because all the people in that room paid money to listen to them talk. But it's not the best way that these people learn. By the way, how can you tell this is a staged photo? This is not real. How can you tell?
They're paying attention.
Everybody's paying attention, absolutely.
People in the back are paying attention.
Yeah, people in the back are paying attention. There's nobody doing Sudokus or checking their email or on their phone. Nobody's making out over there in the corner. Yeah. This is what I call distance education. Because look how far it is. Physically and intellectually. We know that this is really how it works. Oops. Right? So there's lots of problems. Students aren't learning as much, they're not enjoying it, they're very different than they used to be. They think differently than they used to think. Employers aren't getting what they want, we're not producing enough of them. I mean, it's just bad news all around, okay? And we're gonna be out of luck if we don't do something about it. So what do we do? What's the best way to respond? Well, one thing is to realize that just having information online is not the same thing as really knowing what to do with it. Data is not wisdom. In the same sense that a pile of bricks is not a building. Discrete pieces of data needs to be linked to make information. That can be organized to make knowledge, and then you have to learn to apply it to be wise. Students need to be taught this. And we need everybody to recognize that this is the case. Okay, so that's one thing, but that's important. But this is really the key right here, our trump card. This is a study. It's actually the most highly cited study in all of higher education by a team led by Alexander Aston, and they tried to answer the question, what matters in college? Okay, in terms of student success. So it's actually a really simple study in design. What they did was they characterized students. They surveyed the heck out of them, and they found out what the obvious things, race and gender and socioeconomic status and all that, but also educational level of the parents, rural or urban, what kind of reading material was in the home, what kind of college did they go to, did they participate in intramural sports, were they part of the the Greek system, did they used the library, how many hours a week did they study. They collected all this stuff, dumped it in the big regression bin, and just turned to crank. It was a really simple study to find out what correlated most highly with student success in college, as measured by graduation rates and GPA. Okay? Simple study. Turns out there's one factor that overrides all the rest. People. If there's somebody who cares for how you do, you tend to do better. Make sure you write that down on your national plan. It's not a shocker. It's nice that it's been so carefully delineated. But this is what we have over the brick and mortars have over online. Okay. You might say, well, online's got things like Facebook. That's online, right? Online relationships. If Facebook was so great, there wouldn't be a need for parties. Think back to that original cartoon. I had to look through a lot of pictures to find a picture I could show you of a college party. But we are wired to want to be near people and face-to-face with people. It's not as good as online. Okay? There's still things like this. eHarmony, 20% of all American marriages come out of this site. Last summer, 2 summers ago, I walked my daughter down the aisle with the young man she met on eHarmony. Working out pretty well. You may not like that. Too bad. Okay? That's the way it is. Doesn't fit with your morals. You think there's something fundamentally evil about this. That's irrelevant. That's what's happening. And that's what students today are doing. So whether you like it or not, that's what's going on. Okay? Well, here's something else. We don't want to waste people's talents. Can you recognize what's going on here? What that is a picture of?
Telephone operating board.
Yeah, those are telephone operators from way back when. That's a network router, actually. And then this, I like this picture so much, I actually purchased it online, of course, from the National Archives and blew it up. It's framed, it's in my office on the wall. This is a 1924, I don't know if you can read it, it says computing division, computing section. 1924 computer room from the Federal, what was it called? Veterans Bureau is what it was called back then. They were, the computer room here, they were calculating veterans' benefits. Had a lot of veterans in the First World War and all that. The thing that's interesting about this, I don't know if you've ever seen a vintage 1924 computer before, but the thing that's interesting is the computers are not the adding machines. The computers are all the women that are running the adding machines. First of all, it's almost all women. But if you looked at their job description, it would say computer. Because that's what they did all day long, was compute. Now, why don't we do that anymore? Because that would be really stupid, right? I mean, there's a whole lot better technology to do that that's faster, more accurate. If it breaks down, you call in the IT folks. You don't have to pay for healthcare and all that stuff. We wouldn't waste people's talents by having them do that. Technology has advanced far beyond that. Well, guess what? If all you're doing is standing and lecturing at students who aren't very well prepared mentally to receive that sort of information, you can and probably should be replaced by an iPod. Because students would love to get the information that way. They can sit there on the bus. They do it. They sit there on the bus and they watch the videos. Now, whether the video is something they're getting off Netflix or some lecture that you've put together for them in a little 5 or 10 minute snippet, because that's all they can really pay attention to, doesn't matter. But that's the way they're used to getting information. If we offload all that content delivery, not all, if we offload a lot of the content delivery to outside of class, that frees up the teacher to do this kind of stuff. Anybody recognize this small chunk of a big painting by Raphael? That's Socrates. Yep. Socrates is asking questions, empathizing, figuring out what's the student thinking about, what do I have to do to get the student thinking along the directions that I want, how can I change the way the student's thinking. That's what people are good at. That's what people skills are. Computers can't do that. Now, the artificial intelligence folks say that in 10 years they'll be able to, but they've been telling us that for decades. So we have our jobs for at least 10 more years. Okay, so free up people's and use people's talents to the best. Now, you're just going to have to entertain me on this. I want to tell you how we got into this situation. So it's a little bit of a history lesson here, right? Because I was curious, lecture halls are everywhere. How did they even get started? Well, the Greeks began all this This is the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. It's within sight of the Acropolis, actually. And it's a really good place. I've had people tell me that they have stood down here and talked in about a voice like this, and you can be heard way up here in the cheap seats. And the best translation is probably beholding area. You can correct me on this probably. Theatron. We get our word theater from that, but that was like the beholding area, the seats. Okay? And this is where, this is the Theater of Dionysus, god of wine, was it, or goddess of wine? Which? God of wine. Okay. So they had religious services there, and then, of course they had plays and stuff like that. Of course, when the Romans came along, they did the same thing. No sense coming up with something that somebody else figured out. Only they paid attention, instead of beholding, to the listening. Audience, auditorium, the audio part. But again, was not used for education. In fact, they wouldn't even understand the question. If you could somehow transport yourself back there and say, so have you folks thought about using that for education? Because back then, education was done for the elite. It wasn't used, it's sort of the square peg in the round hole thing. You had people like Pythagoras with his disciples, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. A small group of disciples would cluster around the teacher, and they would profess things, and the students would learn that. In fact, they wouldn't write it down. Plato was worried about writing as a technology. He was afraid that if people started writing things, then their memories would go down the tubes, and he was right. So think about that next time you're trying to decide if students should bring laptops in or not. Okay. Well, it might be too late. So the Greeks did education in a different way. What matters, the Greeks are smart, was that social interaction. So how did we get here? How did these auditorium or theater spaces get turned into lecture halls in the first place? Turns out it's interesting because you can pinpoint the date and the person. Turns out you can blame the Catholic Church. Pope Gregory VII in 1079 got the word here. There's the word coming in with this down. Sort of making fun, but it was actually a really smart thing. The Pope decided that the clergy needed to be educated because they were incredibly powerful back then. I mean, they had the power of life and death, but they also had the power of afterlife. Okay, so they could make sure things didn't go so well here, then you'd really be in trouble after that. So he wanted to make sure that the clergy, and there were a lot of them, he wanted to make sure the clergy knew the dogma and knew the rules. This is what you're supposed to be doing. As far as I can tell, this is the first example of a large number of people needing to be educated at once. I could tell you a really bad pun about mass education, but well, the problem with this, of course, this is 1079. This is 400 years almost before Gutenberg came out with his Bible, with the printing press. So you can't just hand them a copy of the church dogmatics or something like that, or even hand them the Bible. There weren't that many around. So what do? Well, it turns out they were absolutely brilliant. They took the skills that the people had in the settings that they were in and the technology they had, and they worked them together, and it was great. Monks had this incredible talent for copying. They would spend their entire lives copying scripture. Really, really, really high fidelity copies. 70 years of copying. They're very good. And where did the monks live? Monasteries. And what did the monasteries have? Auditorium spaces. Not for plays, but for religious services. You take all those faithful monks and you put them up there in the beholding area, or the auditorium area, and you hire a reader, a person who comes in with their handwritten manuscript, their handwritten book, and they would read it line by line by line. And all those monks would copy it just like they were used to, line by line by line. And they didn't step back. They didn't say, okay, now let's compare how John talks about this compared to Mark over. They didn't do that. They just read it out, and they all copied it. And as soon as they were all done copying, then they could hire themselves out as readers. Our word lecturer actually comes from that. A lecturer is not a speaker. A lecturer is a reader. Worked great. In fact, it worked so well that 1,000 years later, we are still doing it. 1,000 years. Anything changed since then? Well, a few things. A few things have changed. So that's a problem. So what's wrong with lecturing? Well, it treats all the students as if they're the same. Actually, it probably treats the folks in the back assuming that, it assumes they have better eyesight and hearing. But otherwise, everybody gets the same thing. It's hard to engage the students unless you've got some kind of a showman. I remember I was an undergrad at Penn State, and we had a building called the Forum, which was kind of appropriately named, I guess. And it was this round building, and it was really steep And there was like 300 or 400 students in my chemistry class, and I remember the professor would run up the stairs and run down and wave his hands. It was really entertaining. Just don't ask me any chemistry questions. I'm actually a pretty good lecturer, as it turns out. Unfortunately, my students don't learn very much because their brains just don't work there. I can't get to them to give individual assistance. Physically, I can't get there. And so students aren't stupid. What happens is that they quit coming. Attendance rates plummet. And faculty complain. I mean, I've got the word success here in quotes, poor success rates. Faculty know that we can't fail everybody. And so we fail as many as we think is reasonable, and then we dumb down a test and complain that students aren't as smart as they used to be, which we now know is true. But the real problem is students aren't learning. That's what we started out with. There was a really interesting, well, no, actually, this is the interesting part about it. It works for me and it works for you. Right? Think about it. You, personally, are probably one of the best students you've ever met. Be honest. If you're not willing to go that far, I bet you're willing to wish that all your students that you had now were as dedicated as you were. Well, it's not going to happen. Okay? But that's the problem, is it worked for all of us. And so if students coming in can't get it, well, that's okay. They don't deserve to come through. Physicists are actually worse at this probably than anybody else. We take a little bit of pride in the fact that our courses are the toughest ones on campus, right? 40% failure rate, look at all those dumb students. It'd be smart to be a physicist. Did I mention that I'm a physicist? Well, we can't afford to do that anymore. We can't afford to fail those people. If you don't think that's true about the faculty feeling that way, I sat in on a lecture given by a chemistry education researcher once, and she was talking about how she had studied Piagetian mental developmental stages in college freshmen taking chemistry, which is typically taught with abstract level thinking instead of concrete. What she found is that about a third of the students that she surveyed had not made the progression from concrete level thinking up to abstract, which is where all the material was. And I'm sitting in the back, and there's two chemistry faculty members in front of me. And one of them, you could tell he was all excited, and he looks at the other one and he says, you know, we fail about a third of our students. I wonder if it's the same third. And if it is, I wonder if we could change the way we teach, and maybe they could pass. The other faculty member turned with a perfectly straight face and said, why on earth would we want to do that? So they're out there. Here's a really neat study that was done a couple of years ago. They showed videos, physics videos, to students that were taking physics and to physics faculty members. Watch these videos, and then after the video is over, they hand them out these checklists of topics. Check the areas that were explicitly discussed in the lecture. And the students check, 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 faculty check, 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 and then they compared. They went back and they played the videos and they looked at those topics. Turns out the students were right on the nose. They were pretty good at this. They've been practicing that a lot. The faculty were horrendous. They said everything was talked about explicitly. They can remember hearing the words that were never there. Because to a faculty member, when the lecturer in the video says A, well, that's the same thing as B. And I remember figuring out that C is just a little step from that, and D is just the general case. All of those, when A is said, all of those neurons in the brain get fired. So as far as the faculty member is concerned, they heard that stuff. Of course, a student sits there, they don't have all those connections. They hear part of A. That's it. So it turns out some of the worst people to evaluate the quality of a lecture are area experts. People who know that content area, because they will hear things that were never said. All right, so that's sort of setting the stage. So what did Scale Up do about all this? Well, we redesigned the classrooms. This is one of those teal classrooms at MIT, probably one of the more expensive installations, but it's just like this, round tables. Students can get around, or faculty can get around from student to student. Nobody can hide in these spaces. This is called a studio, and it's not a new idea. You're probably familiar with art studios. When you go to art school, you don't go to art school to hear the professor stand at the podium and say, now students, write this down. It's going to be on the test. If you take yellow paint, cadmium yellow, and you mix it with blue paint, you'll get green. Write it down. That's not why you go to art school. In art school, they hand you a tube of yellow paint and a tube of blue paint and give you a palette and a brush. And you mix it up and go, oh, look, that makes pretty. You learn by doing. So art studios, we've been doing that a long time. Dance studios, the same thing. Students are all doing their thing. And that frees the professor, the teacher, whatever they're called in an art school or in an advanced school, goes around and says, no, you need to point your toes more or whatever it is you do. This is from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, 1922. Civil engineering studio. This is my grandson's kindergarten classroom. Those teachers have been trained in educational psychology. They know how people learn. You don't see many lecture halls in an elementary school. Well, guess what? By the time those kids get to college, they're not thinking much differently. It'd be nice if they were, but they're not. So, we have these round tables, and there's lots of these different installations. I showed you that map. Almost all of them are round tables, but actually we're now working with smaller classroom designs, and we're sort of making it D-shaped. We're trying some things. But anyway, 7 feet in diameter, at least 5 feet apart. You want to be able to get in between. I want to be able to get over here in case there's another table over here, or at least to get cookies. Okay? I need to be able to get to everybody. In fact, this is a little snug here. I might not want to walk through here and ask you questions. Okay? So I need lots of room to be able to circulate. The 7 feet diameter actually came from research. Once I started with rectangular tables, and if you've ever worked in a team at a rectangular table, you know that that doesn't work very well. I mean, you're doing this. So once I decided on round tables, I tried 4 different diameters before I found the ideal size. And that's by sitting people at a table for 3 or 4 weeks, videotaping it, having field observers note the interactions that were going on, doing focus groups, moving them to another table geometry, repeating over and over again. So anyway, so we did that. Teacher station is actually best if the teacher station is in the center. We found that out because you can see what's happening here. When it's close to the edge, the teacher spends a lot of time writing and lecturing. So it's actually better if the teacher station's in the center. I used to have this wonderful computer tablet. I could write on a tablet, and it appeared on all the screens. I quit using it because I was talking too much. I can tell if a teacher's going to have a hard time when they walk in with a big stack of beautiful, colorful transparencies they've been working on for 20 years. Anyway, the idea is that since the content, most of the content is delivered outside of class, the instructor is free to roam around, listen in on conversations, get them doing something interesting, ask questions, start arguments between groups of students, tell them, well, gee, their work looks a little bit different than your work over here. Is theirs different enough to worry about, or is it just a variation? Things like that. I like to say that having that content delivered outside of the classroom frees the instructor up from the tyranny of having to deliver that content during class. Why pay some really smart person a lot of money to stand and essentially say what's in the book when we can have the students just read it or watch it on video? There's 3 teams of 3 students at each table. The room is surrounded by whiteboards like you have here. And a lot of places, they also have smaller group-size whiteboards that the students can work on, 1 whiteboard per team. One nice thing about having whiteboards like this is that everybody can see everybody else's work. One bad thing about having whiteboards like this is that everybody can see everybody else's work. So if if everybody has a different approach, this is wonderful. But if you're giving them sort of a drill and practice kind of thing, everybody needs to practice a few of these problems. As soon as the first group is done, especially if you've trained the class to be looking on the whiteboards, as soon as the first group gets done, everybody's finished. So with group-sized whiteboards, they're working like this. They still have to work in their team. You don't want them writing on this mashed paper stuff, because that's hard to read. I can't see what you're doing. But if you were writing on a big whiteboard, I could just walk by and glance down and say, oh, they've got a really nice thing here. When the time comes, I'm going to have that group show what they did. So group-sized whiteboards are nice, and wallboards are also very nice. Every student in my room has a name tag. You can see we've had some fairly famous students. We had them come down and take the classrooms. But I call on every student by name. There's 100 students in my room, and they think within a week I know everybody's name. Do I? No, there's a name tag in front of everybody. But what I will do is, as I'm walking around the room and looking at things, I'll look at Stamatis' name tag and say, that's a funny name. And then I'll walk over here, and later in the class I'll say, okay, who's got the answer on this? Stamatis, you over there. And everybody thinks I know his name, which I actually do, because he doesn't have a name tag. So you can trick the students, and believe it or not, you actually do end up learning their names for that semester. I'm horrible at names, but I will learn their names for a semester. because the names are right in front of me all the time. Collect homework, depending on the kind of class you've got. I teach physics, so I have to collect homework, but I can't grade 100 papers every day. So I have WebAssign, a web-based homework delivery system, and that makes sure everybody puts in answers, but I'm actually more interested in how they solve the problems. And so WebAssign requires answers. I'll roll a 12-sided die, and it looks like table 4 has to hand in their written solutions, and I will grade those very carefully. The reason it's a lottery is just an accident of my room. I've got 11 tables in my room, and that's a 12-sided die. So it's a lottery. If a 12 comes up, everybody gets credit. I'm not sure why that's such a big deal, but the students think it's a wonderful thing. And so if I roll the die and it doesn't stop under the document camera, I have to roll it again, because I might be cheating. This is something that we came up with that I didn't realize was going to work like this. I call it pass and reflect. Students do some activity, spends 10 or 15 minutes on an activity. Then what I tell them is, take your notebook and hand it, oops, that's interesting, paper disappeared. Hand that notebook to the person on your right. And take 2 minutes to summarize what we just did. What was important about it? Why were we doing that? What was the central theme? And then when you're done, pass it back. Whoops. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I think I probably gonna have to go through everything all over. I will. So I'll talk while I'm doing that. So they pass it back, and then as a way to summarize, what I'll do is I'll say, okay, look at what's been written down in front of you. Who's got something good? Well, you'll raise your hand and say, oh, I've got something, let me share this with the class. So that does two things. The thing I was expecting it to do was get the main points out for everybody. What I didn't realize was going to happen is, you just told the entire class that you did a great job. How often do students get opportunities to praise each other for high quality academic work? And yet they do. And it really changed the environment, the feeling of the classroom. So anyway, so they did that. They also wanted more than 2 minutes to write, and I was really surprised that they actually wanted time to learn about science, but they did. So let's see, I'm not quite sure why I'm doing this twice, but there we go. All right, so here we are again. Sorry about this. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about this UP part of Scale Up, the upside down pedagogies part. It's backwards design of instruction. So you start with where you want to end up. What do you want students to be able to do at the end of the semester? The word understand is not in there because I don't know what that means. What can they do? In other words, if you can't figure out what that's all about, just imagine you're walking by a student and you glance down and you go, oh yeah, he's got that, he really knows it, he really understands it. What was he doing that convinced you that he understood it? He was doing something, okay? That doing part is what you would write down in these performance outcomes. Once you've got those, then you come up with ways to test, to see if they can do that, which isn't too hard, because if you decide, you know, they should be able to do this, then to assess them, you ask them to do this. Okay, so writing tests becomes almost trivial. Then finally, it's time to think about instruction. What resources, what am I going to have the students doing in order for them to be able to do well on these assessments, to demonstrate that they can do these things? See how it's backwards? You end up on designing the instruction instead of starting with that. So it's upside down in that sense. It's also the roles have been switched, so most of the time the students are doing the teaching. I can't get to everybody, so I have the students teaching each other. I actually structure the groups so that happens. We'll talk about that. And I've got data from multiple schools that shows the students who are doing the teaching actually learn the most. There's a cognitive science term called cognitive rehearsal that explains that, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then finally, it is a flipped classroom in the sense that things that used to happen outside the classroom, really hard homework problems, happen inside the classroom. And content delivery, which used to happen inside the classroom, happens outside. So they watch videos, they read the book, they go on YouTube, whatever they need to do, they go to the Khan Academy, but they get the material that way, the basics. Then they come to class and you have them do really hard things while you are right there to help them. And while they are there with a whole bunch of peers to help them through it. So you can give them harder things than you could before. Yes?
Should I ask a question later or ask a question now?
Well, you just asked one question, so why don't you ask another?
All right, so two questions for one. Thanks. So talking about content delivery, I mean, doesn't this still imply kind of a passive model of I'm going to give out the output and they input it? I guess because my dilemma with all this, it makes perfect sense, but in the classroom, what I want students to be able to do is this dialectic of moving back and forth between hearing a concept but not necessarily knowing what it means, and then doing an application right there, and then going back and forth. Okay, here's the abstract, here's the specific and concrete application, and sort of in the class moving back and forth. And so my dilemma then is, it's hard to fit everything in classrooms. So why don't we flip it? But then it's still during the actual sort of short lectures I put up online, I would still feel tempted to want to do a lot of applications, examples, because that's where they really get it.
Well, you
So
can,
then,
yeah, you can do applications and examples and things like that. What I tell the students is, come in with anything you're not sure of. And in fact, I'm actually pretty nasty about this. I give them this big long list of performance outcomes. They know in advance what's going to be on the test, essentially. They don't know the actual problems, but it's there. And I tell them, we don't have time to go over all these because it takes too much time. So the basics, the definitions, that kind of stuff you need to get outside of class. Anything you're not sure of, ask. And then what I'll do is on the first exam when I'm writing it, I'll go through that list and I will specifically pull out things that we didn't talk about in class. Put them on the test. Because you know what happens, right? Student comes in, such and such was on the test and we didn't go over it in class. And my response is, well, why not? Which, they never expect that. So if you don't understand something, you need to ask. But you can, and you can deliver some content in class, certainly. I'm not saying all of it. Right? Basic stuff, push that outside. Don't waste your time as an expert going over simple definitions and things like that. Certainly applications that are hard, you're going to probably need to do those in class. But the idea is you can free up class time to do that now, if a lot of it is pushed out longer.
But so briefly, do you operationalize content though? I mean, does this mean sort of many just still lecturing at them?
Can be.
Or does it mean something?
It can be. If you've got this really sterling little explanation of something, it's much better than what's in the book. Make a video of it. And then watch your students watching the video. It's really weird to walk by the library and glance in and see students, you're teaching people, but you are. And you can include examples, especially if it's something sort of interesting and unique. I remember I was doing, I don't remember now what it was, but it had to do with dimensions of things, and it was something about the dimensions. You're in Chicago and you drop your iPod, and the dimensions of the iPod compared to the dimensions of the city of Chicago, oh, that's what it was, is about the same as the dimensions of a nucleus of an atom to a whole atom itself. And so I remember going through that and bringing a map of Chicago and and all that, and I did that as a little video chunk. So you can get that sort of thing. Here's an example from physics. Sorry about that. But just to show you what this might be like. So this is chapter 22, section 4. They need to identify and explain specific situations where Gauss's law can be useful and where it's not. And then use Gauss's law to find the electric field due to a point charge. Use it to find the electric field due to these other things. Very, very specific. Why should it be a guessing game? Why should students have to guess what's important? You tell them what's important. This is what you need to get out of this class. The more of these you can do, the better your grade's going to be. It's as simple as that. I tell them I would love to get called down to the department head's office to explain why every one of my students got an A. Because I would just take their problem exams and show them. Actually, I just got an email today. My students took an exam on Tuesday night. The average was 88. Yes?
Yeah, so do they have one shot at getting these performance outcomes, or?
What do you mean by getting them?
Like I'm thinking of standards-based grading where, you can try to get, 22 for.
If you don't get it the first time, do it again?
Yeah.
You can do it that way, I suppose. I don't, but
No,
I know
in
people
your
do
class,
that.
they take tests.
They take tests. They have quizzes, things like that. I didn't used to give them quizzes. They asked for quizzes every week. Because what was happening is they were working in class and everything made sense. They were working outside of class on homework, everything made sense. Then they went and took the test and they couldn't do it. Because that was the first time I ever asked them to do anything on their own. So now I give them a quiz every week to give them a little bit of a calibration. Cooperative learning. The nice thing about it is it's sort of automatically interactive. If students are interacting with each other, it's interactive. And this is at the sort of the top of Bloom's taxonomy, if you're familiar with that. Knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. There, I just demonstrated a knowledge level understanding of Bloom's taxonomy, because I can repeat it by rote. Anytime you need to memorize something like that, you make a mnemonic. Kevin's computer is an apple, and it's simply evil. Knowledge, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Anyway, they're working at the synthesis and evaluation. They're putting ideas together. They are presenting them to each other, figuring out whether what somebody else is saying if it makes sense or not. Obviously, people by themselves that get stuck. In a group, they share resources. This is what I think is one of the most important things. The students see alternatives different ways of thinking. We structure the groups so that each group has somebody from the top, middle, and bottom third of the class. So the weak students see how the strong students study. Holy cow, you're going to study for the test? That's not until next week. Well, what a thought. Because they probably never saw that happen before. We get better questions asked this way, and then this thing called cognitive rehearsal when they teach each other. You know, first time you teach a course, that's when you really learn the material. And there's good cognitive science behind that. An idea in the brain is I like to think of it as like a constellation. That's, instead of a bunch of stars being interconnected, it's a bunch of brain cells that are interconnected. And it's these connections that hold the concept. Just like it's not the stars that are the constellation, it's the lines between them. Well, if I'm trying to explain something to you, I've got my own little constellation here and I'm throwing these ideas out and it's not making sense, I'm going to say, well, let's see. What about this? Okay, now it makes sense to you. Well, what have I just done for my constellation? I just added some more connections to it. So my understanding is now better than it was before by explaining it to somebody else. That's why you understand something better after you have taught it. Yes?
I have a very detailed question, I guess. What do you do when your course isn't divisible by 3? Do you do
Then you have a group of
two-person or
4 or a
four?
group of 2. You could ask them what they want to do.
You don't have any strong preference.
I usually ask the students. Here are secrets to making groups work. There has to be individual accountability. They can't use the groups as a way to get out of stuff. You have to be careful on this because they will try. There has to be a reason to work in groups. Positive interdependence. Give them things that are too hard for even the best student in the class to do by themselves. Have them share resources, something like that, so there's a reason for these groups to come together. You have to give them opportunities to interact. You have to train them in how to do this because they probably have never been trained in how to work in a group. They've been in plenty of groups, and a third of the class hates them. The top students hate groups because everybody sponges off them. And the weak students love groups because they can sponge off everybody. So you have to teach them how to work in teams. And you have to give them opportunities to assess how well their team is functioning. This is how I set up groups. I rank the students from top to bottom. They don't know this, but I rank them. And how I do that depends. If it's a second semester course, it's easy because you just use your first semester grades. But if you don't have that, you could give them a math pretest or a physics concept test or just use their GPA, but you rank them. And then you divide the class into thirds. And each group has somebody from the top, middle, and bottom third of the class. And in this room, I would take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would take the top 5 students and put one at every table. So every student in the room is guaranteed to have somebody really good nearby. And somebody in the top third in their team. Might be them. I used to pair up women in minorities, thinking that that would help because too often people from underrepresented groups aren't listened to. A woman will say something in a team and nobody does anything and they just keep talking. And then later on, one of the male students says pretty much the same thing and everybody goes, yeah. I don't know why, but it happens. Anyway, oftentimes people do that. And then I found that we need to reshuffle the groups 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a semester. After every exam, I put them in new groups. I've got a new batch of data to sort on, okay, to rank them. What I found was if I did not put them in new groups, they got to be such good friends that they had too much to talk about in class. So I couldn't keep them focused. How do you get these different kinds of students to work in a group? The top students are motivated by grades. And so, you give a 5-point bonus to teams that have an average above 80 on a test. So let's say, here's 3 of us, and you're the high-end person, you're the middle person, and I'm the low-end person in the group. Okay? We study together. We help each other learn. What that really means is you help us learn. Okay? If that works so well that our average is 80 or better, each of us gets 5 points added to our grade on this test as a teamsmanship bonus. Well, you know, you have to have those 5 points. I mean, that's what's motivating you. You want 105 on this test. Okay? And you can get it. You have to be careful, though. It has to be the average. Because if the rule is you get a 5-point bonus if the lowest score is above 80, it won't work. Because I'm not a very good student, and I can't do it. They're smarter than I am. They know I can't do it. So it falls apart. But if I could get a 70 on my own, let's say, if they help me, I might get a 75. Well, if I get a 75, she's going to ace it, right? And you're going to do pretty well. The average will be about 80. I'll go from 70 on my own to 75 because I've learned more, and actually so have they. up to another 5 points. I'll get up to an 80 because of teamsmanship skills. I will have seen how a good team works. Now, you may not like giving points for something that's not content, but remember, that's what employers want. If we want students to learn those skills, you have to give them points for it, or they won't do it. So that's how you get the high-end people to work in the team. The low-end people are tough because they're trying to avoid work, but in fact, that's their motivation. They're trying to avoid work, so we have them write contracts. These are the things that we agreed to do to make our team succeed. These are actual student contracts that I copied. Here's one of the best ones I've ever seen. Instructions. Please initial all clauses of this contract you are committed to following. An initial implies that you're committing yourself to abide by the clause, and let's do it. A, I agree to come to class on a regular basis. Initial. B, in the result that I'm unable to attend class, I will make it my personal responsibility to get any and all blah, 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 blah. I don't know if this person was pre-law or what, but the nice thing about it is the students have written this up. It is not my problem. If somebody's not doing their job and I'll get an email saying, hey, Joe isn't coming to our study sessions, I'll email back and say, well, I don't see anything in your contract about that. Too bad. Or I'll see something in there that says, well, your contract says you have to come to class, so you better talk to Joe. And if they don't come, they can get fired from the group. Their teammates can fire them, which they're still responsible for an entire group's worth of work. Remember, these people are trying to avoid work. I think I've had 3 people fired in 17 years. It's so infrequent, I don't even, people ask me, what do you do with a person who's fired? I don't know. I guess you send them out and say, see if you can get another group to take you. Hey, I just got fired from my group. Forget about that 80, average thing, because I'm coming in here and I'm planning on loafing. So I'm guessing that would happen. But it's not my problem. And in fact, the fun thing is we've looked at these contracts because they write 3 or 4 of these. You look at them over time, the closer to the end of the semester it is, the more the consequences are automated. You miss 2 classes without an explanation in advance to your teammates, you are automatically fired. So they know how to make these contracts work. They learn. What's a typical class like? Depends. 5-6 hours a week. In my case, we had 3 hours of lecture, 2 hours of lab. That turned into 5 hours of class. I don't even go to the Friday class. I have my grad student hand out a quiz. They take the quiz and they go over it. And the students catch up on anything they didn't get done over the week, any activities they didn't finish, any homework they need some help with, something like that. We usually start class with a little short intro because lectures are good at helping students organize the material. For some reason, they don't get organization by looking at the topical headings in a book. I don't know why, but they don't. But if you tell it to them, this is the central point, they'll write it down in their national credit finders, and they'll remember it. They're also not going to get excited and motivated by reading a textbook. Hard to fathom that one, but it's true. But if you can get them excited, you can go in and say, hey, I just saw on the news they discovered another planet. That's like 400 or something. How do we discover planets that you can't even see? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So you can get them excited. So lectures are good for some things. We have them do these activities that I call tangibles, which are hands-on measurements and observations, ponderables, which are interesting problems, and visibles, which are simulations. And then we talk about them. We do some more, 15, 20 minutes, activities, more and more, just keep cycling, and then finally we wrap it all up. That's a typical class, but typical is in quotes because it's always different. Always different. So what's a tangible like? Well, how thick is 1 page from your textbook? This is done the first day of class when they haven't had any physics yet. You don't have any measuring devices. How do you figure out how thick a single sheet of paper is in your book? What would you do?
Measure 100 pages.
Why 100 pages?
Because I'm measuring.
Okay. Well, you measure a bunch of pages and you divide by how many pages you've got, okay? Every factor of 10 that you go up in the number of pages, you've just added 1 more digit to the significant figures of your estimate, okay? Once you've done that, then use your new standard for measurement, which is the thickness of a single page, to determine the width of a period at the end of a sentence in that book. How do you do that? Well, you just stack the pages then. But it gives you a chance to talk about measuring standards and all sorts of stuff. Reading universal product codes, this is a fun one. They try to decipher those. Why do you do that? Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff about pattern matching, but also it gives us an opportunity to talk about hypotheses. And I happen to have them do this right before we talk about atomic spectrum, which is almost like barcodes. Ever take a piece of tape? This usually happens around Christmas time, and you peel it up from the table and it wraps itself around your arm. It's really annoying. That's because you've separated charges and it now has an excess charge. How many electrons is that within a factor of 10? You can figure that out with no more information than that. This is a little aluminum block. Holds their name tags. Well, they're cold to the touch, but if you hold it in your hand, it'll warm up. While you're doing that, your hand is is applying thermal energy. What's the power output of your hand in watts? So those are tangibles. Those are observations or measurements. Ponderables, these are problems. You ever notice when you go bowling, the ball skids and rolls, and then skids less and rolls more, and finally it's just rolling? How far does it get before that happens? Almost always somebody will raise their hand and say, oh, it's got to be less than 60 feet. How do they know that?
Because we're
Like,
only on 60 feet.
bowling.
That's the length of a bowling alley, and they've seen it happen, so they know it has to be less than 60 feet. It's always a good idea to know the answer before you start. I teach them that when you're solving problems. If you know what the answer is before you start, you've got a better chance of getting it. This is from, this next one is from a test. I mean, it's a big, long problem, but the idea was that I'm from NC State, which has Carolina and Duke nearby, so anytime any two of those two teams play each other in basketball, pretty much it's the end of the world. And so you happen to be having your friends over to your place after school for snacks to watch the game. And you remember, you're on the way home and you remember, man, I didn't get snacks. So you quick run into the store, and because you're in a hurry, you know that that cart you get is the one with the stupid floppy wheel, right? And you're pushing against that cart. And while you're pushing it, you're wondering, what fraction of a candy bar that I'm picking up off the shelf here? Am I burning up? Anyway, so we've got all kinds of interesting problems like that. Here's an example of a visible that they do. They take measurements on a real spring and a real ball, and then they model it in a computer program. This is student work right here. This is the entire program that creates this thing in 3D right there. All right, did it work? I mentioned that I had data on all this stuff. Let me give you some of it. This is way too complicated, but that's the way it goes. This half is from the first semester of physics on mechanics. This half is from the second semester of physics on electricity and magnetism. Okay? Different schools, NC State, Central Florida, Rochester, MIT, Central Florida again, and different tests. Force concept inventory, I bet you know all these letters. Force and motion conceptual evaluation, you probably do too. Electricity, electrical circuits, concept evaluation. Anyway, different tests, different schools, different teachers, different courses, and then finally, bottom, middle, top, thirds of the class. And then this is something called normalized gain. It's a way of, it's basically percentage of possible progress. It's a way to compare MIT to NC State, where the students start very different places, but I can measure where. The thing I find interesting about this, there's two things. One is you can see pretty much scale up wins, but there's another pattern in there I think is really fascinating. Who gains the most? Top students. How come? They're teaching others. Here's one I got in trouble on. This was for engineering physics, and the engineers wanted demonstration of problem-solving skills, and they were happy with the tests that the faculty had been using for years. So I just went and to the faculty who were lecturing their physics students, and I said, give me your tests. I'm going to randomly pull some questions off and give them to my students. So I gave my students the test they wrote for their students, and my students did about a letter grade better, which kind of ticked off the faculty. So I didn't do that after 2 semesters because it was pretty consistent. You can see the scale-up students do better. The one thing that was interesting was this one problem. The traditional students did better than that, and I thought, well, anything that's a difference in a pattern, you're curious, you go and look. Well, it turns out I had randomly pulled these questions off, and I hadn't even really looked at them. It turns out the one that I had pulled off for number 9 here was one that we hadn't covered yet in scale-up. So then the thing that's interesting is that the scale-up students who had not seen this material before did almost as well as the students who had been taught this in a lecture. Because the scale-up students had been taught explicitly, how do you do things that you've never seen before? That's where you make money. Retention rates. Single email generates within 2 days, 3 days, an Excel spreadsheet with 16,000 students over 5 years in intro physics. Failure rates this way. Overall, the failure rate dropped by a factor of 3. For women, it dropped by a factor of 5. For African Americans, by a factor of 4. These are error bars, by the way. No Hispanic students failed in the scale-up class over those 5 years. The thing I find exciting about this is that the demographics pretty much wash out. It doesn't matter anymore. We think the reason that the women do so well is because it's so highly social and very low risk. Women students tend to, and this isn't me, this is the results of research, not that I've done, but other people have done. Women students often have self-esteem problems. So that if they have an academic difficulty, they think it's because they're stupid. And then you interview them and you'll hear them say, I'm not very good at math, I can't do science, I'm just, just not made to be an engineer, or whatever it happens to be. And so if they're in a lecture hall and they don't understand something, rather than raise their hand and reveal their ignorance, they'll follow the sage advice, it's better to be silent and have people think you're a fool than to say something and remove all doubt. So they sit there and they don't get the question answered. Now, in fact, probably most of the class was lost, but they didn't ask. Well, in the scale-up section, you don't understand something, you'll ask her. She's right beside you. And if she doesn't know, you'll ask the whole table. If there's 9 students who don't know the answer, is it your fault? No. It's clearly my fault. So she'll raise her hand. And in fact, we've got lots of data that shows we get much better questions in terms of quality. We don't get, is this going to be on the test? We get, what happens when you raise the temperature? Something like that. You get a lot better questions, a lot more questions. We were actually worried about that because we dropped the failure rate to what it was before. What happens when these students get to their later engineering classes? If we're supposed to be the filter for engineering, which is what we had been, what happens if they then get filtered later? We're slacking off here. We should have failed those students early on so that they could have changed their major in time. Well, it turns out the failure rate in those later classes didn't change. The only way that's possible is that people who would have failed probably aren't. The only way you can test that is to put a gold star on their forehead in advance, or at least before you look at the data. Who's at risk of failing in an engineering course? And first of all, make it easier on yourself. We picked engineering statics because that's most like mechanics or the physics, right? We said if a student's SAT score was less in math, was less than 500, they were at risk of failure. And we went and looked. And if that was the case, if they took a scale-up class, they failed 17% of the time. If they did not, they failed almost a third of the time in that later course. We knew that that had to be the case. We knew that people who should have failed weren't. Okay? But we needed a way to test it, so we did. MIT, they looked a year and a half later with conceptual tests. They were still able to pick out the students who had taken their TO classes as compared to the traditional classes. They can't do this anymore because they teach all of their intro physics courses this way. So where are we now? Well, oops, past that. There's MIT, here's Iowa, Minnesota. Some of you have seen this Minnesota building has 20 scale-up classes in it. This is now up to 191 that I know about. Ithaca College, Clemson, there's lots and lots of universities. Clemson teaches all of their intro math, up through and including differential equations this way. Different schools teach different things. I'm trying to get folks to share their instructional materials as they go. So, here's a bunch of different photos from different places. They're all pretty much the same. This one's a little hard to read because it's small and in Hebrew, but it's spreading all over the place, but it's pretty much the same sort of design. It's all based on the name, student-centered, active learning environment with upside-down pedagogies. Collaborative teams for students, and it's student-centered. I mean, you imagine being a student, if I'm sitting at a table and looking straight ahead, what am I seeing? Other students. Okay, so it really is student-centered. It's not teacher-centered anymore. It's active learning, they're doing these activities. The environment is designed to facilitate these interactions. And then we've got those upside-down pedagogies that we've talked about. So, there's my email. You can email me if you have more questions. If you want, you can go to the Scale-Up website. There's all kinds of stuff there. There's pictures of a lot of different places, including now Seattle Pacific. I just took a picture of this room and stuck it up there today. And if you want more information, you can email me and request a password. You can get in deeper, and there's a couple of dozen research papers. There's instructional materials. There's hints on how to divide people up into teams. There's spreadsheets to print out name tags. I mean, I have to hand out 100 name tags every day. I can do it in 30 seconds because they're printed out in different colors. So I just take my stack of name tags and take the red ones and plop them here, and take the blue ones and plop them here, and take the green ones and plop them here. I don't have to read anything. And then I can collect them the same way. So there's lots and lots of stuff on there. Even how to make little name tag holders out of paper clips. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. So if you are interested, go ahead and take a look at that. And I left almost no time for questions. Yes?
The video,
The video. Be a little more explicit.
the one right
That
there,
video,
how
okay.
can we acquire it?
I have no idea.
It will be on iTunes U.
It'll be on iTunes U.
Send out announcement.
And everybody sends me $1 before they watch it, right?
Yes. Any data with non-STEM disciplines?
Yes, there is data from non-STEM. University of Iowa is probably the best place. There's lots of interesting things. I mean, obviously, since I started this in physics, that's where most of the data is. There's, for example, there's somebody that's teaching political science. And what they'll do is they'll tell us, they'll pick some current event. And remember, every team or every table has an A, B, and a C team. They'll pick some current event, gun laws, okay? All the A teams, go to Fox News and the web. Find out what they're saying about Obama administration and gun laws. All the B teams, go to MSNBC. See how they talk about gun laws. All the C teams, go to BBC. See if they even talk about it at all, but what they say. And then compare. You know, did they say the same thing? Well, it's the same topic. I mean, gee, there's some surprising differences here. Talk about that. This is supposed to be fair and balanced. So you can discuss that. And then what they do is they tell the students, pick some other current event of your choice and scour the web and learn as much about it as you can. And then pretend that you are, each individual, pretend that you are working for one of those media outlets and write the story up like a reporter. And you give that to somebody else and see if they can figure out who you're working for. So there's lots of interesting non-STEM things you can do. It's just that STEM is what I go by. So you were stuck with me. Yes? I was supposed to come stand by you, but forgot.
I know, and my heart's broken. I do something very similar with my biology courses when I have a revision where I assign a real-world research project to the class. And as a class, they work on this research project. They typically divide up into very high-performing students, and then the rest of them get left to the outside. My question is, I love the way you're dividing up. I've done that also in the past. Would the high-performing students working together in the same way do better in groups of high-performing students than in mixed groups?
Actually, there has been a study of that. Anybody familiar with that study? You know the one I'm talking about? And I believe what they found is that the students in the heterogeneous groups, the mixed groups, did better even than the top students by themselves because they weren't pushed. So there's a real benefit. Yeah, it's generally not a good idea to let students pick their own teams because you'll oftentimes get, you know, two roommates and somebody who's really left out, or worse, you'll get boyfriend, girlfriend, spectator, which is not a good thing. There's supposedly tomorrow, right, going to be a workshop where people will get a chance, we'll go into more details of things if you have questions, and you'll get a chance to do some of these activities.
Yeah, that's with the learning community, so we didn't intentionally try to exclude anyone. We'll record that too for people that aren't in one of those learning communities.
That'll be a really boring thing because you'll get to watch other people working. Yes?
So the gist of it, though, is you have a very hard problem. All the groups work on the problem. One group gets the answer. You go right, and then you would tell us how you did it.
Your assumption is that there is the answer. If they're making estimates or looking things up on the web, they may have different numbers to start from. Or if they're looking, you know, if it's not a mathematical sort of problem, they are getting sources from different places. I almost always ask them to justify where they get their information. So for example, well, as an example, this past week they were calculating or working with momentum. So I said, okay, all the A groups, I want the momentum of a fast runner. B groups, I want the momentum of a pitched baseball. C groups, I want the momentum of the fastest man-made object. Everybody wanted to work in C groups because that was more interesting, but nonetheless, the A groups had to tell me, well, what kind of runner? And some of them, you know, somebody said, well, I estimated a mass of this, and I can run about this fast. Somebody else said, we went and found out about Julian Bolt or whatever his name is. Okay.
Usain Bolt.
Is it? What is it? I don't remember his first name. I just remember his last name.
Usain Bolt.
Okay, but I thought Bolt was a good name. The B groups, you know, well, you know, they need the mass of a baseball. Where'd you get that from? Well, they found it on some site that had, you know, teacher put a bunch of stuff. Who at this table knows that that person's a teacher? Nobody. Well, then I don't believe it. So where do you go? You go to the Major League Baseball site. Things like that. So that's, I think, a really important skill that they're not very good at is validating information. But if you make interesting problems, they won't have the same kind of answers. They'll come up with different ones. Or you give them a variety of problems to look at and compare. You know, what's, you know, come up with something that's got as big a momentum as you can think of. And then they have to say, well, let's see, we can take a great big thing like an aircraft carrier, but that's not going very fast. But we can take something like a bullet that's going really fast, but not much mass. And you have to, you know, make judgments about that and figure this out. Other questions?
I have a question about your sticking students in groups. How long does it take for them to mesh as a group? And then when you change them up partway through, does that mesh time decrease or stay the same, or how does that work?
That's interesting. I actually was thinking of collecting data on this by getting a decibel meter, sound level meter. Because the first day of class is bizarre because it's so quiet. And after you put them in groups, it's still pretty quiet, but it gets louder and louder and louder. Then you put them in groups of the first time new groups, and it noise level goes down. But finally, by the third or fourth time, being so I was thinking of quantifying that because I have noticed that it's really interesting. They get into groups a lot faster as they practice that. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Okay.